So now it is my pleasure to introduce our conference chair, Doug McLeod. Doug has worked in energy and environmental issues for 25 years, and his roles have included attorney, developer, and government official. A resident of Maui, Doug developed the first feed-in tariff system in Hawaii, the first carport PV system on Maui, and served a term as Energy Commissioner for the County of Maui, which includes Molokai and Lanai. Doug is a founder of the Maui Energy Conference, and as you know, serves as our conference chair again this year. He also serves as vice president of the Maui Tomorrow Foundation and runs 2 private businesses with operations on Maui and Oahu, DKK Energy Services and DKK Properties. Please join me in welcoming Doug to the Maui Energy Conference stage.
Good morning and aloha. You know, when I first heard there were people who would sing to their plants and that these people believed that the plants were responding to the songs, I thought the people were crazy. And, you know, frankly, some of them may be crazy, but it turns out there is a valid scientific explanation for the effect. It has nothing to do with the content of what the person is singing, the language they're singing in, or even if it's a spoken word or a song. So what does happen, and what does matter here? Every time we exhale, every single time we're sending out a burst of carbon dioxide, CO2. And it turns out that if you do that inside a building or in a greenhouse, you can have effect on a plant because of the carbon dioxide. You remember this from high school. Plants take CO2 out of the atmosphere, and they give us back O2, oxygen, which of course we need. You know, and it turns out that carbon dioxide at the right place at the right time is a pretty good thing, especially for plants. Since we're on Maui, we also need to mention just how critically important carbon dioxide is for coral reefs. In addition, the shells of many of the sea creatures themselves require the carbon to be deposited into the ocean. So again, being on Maui, we really need to recognize that carbon dioxide is critically important. Well, let's end the scientific review portion of this speech with the surprisingly accurate general statement that carbon dioxide at sea level is a pretty beneficial thing. But once it gets high enough into the atmosphere that trees don't reach, it can become a long-lasting problem. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 5th Annual Maui Energy Conference. We appreciate the fact that so many of you have taken time to come here. We know that travel can be long and burdensome. You know, I still remember the first time we did this 5 years ago, and we had a lot of doubts. We didn't know, would people come to Hawaii? Would people be brave enough in their own offices on the mainland to go to their boss and say, yes, this is a business trip to Maui, and it's really important to come? So we appreciate that. And one of the other things that we really appreciate, and Leslie mentioned this and Tina mentioned this a little bit, we have had just a tremendous level of support from the Japanese government and some of the major Japanese companies. And as I look back on the history of the conference and how we got here, the willingness of the Japanese government agency NATO to support our efforts on Maui, and in particular, their willingness to fund the Jump Smart Maui project, that really gave us the confidence to go out and feel that there was something for people to see on Maui in the renewable energy area, that if you spent all the time and all the hours in the airplane, that you would in fact find some interesting things here. And I want to really note the leadership of Hitachi in implementing the Jump Smart Maui project here. And again, NATO and Hitachi gave us some confidence that there is something here to be seen. Now the other thing that really gave us the courage to start holding an energy conference on a remote island was the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative. HCEI is the acronym you'll normally hear people use. And I expect you're going to hear that acronym used quite a bit this morning. This year is the 10th anniversary of HCEI. And we're going to begin our program this morning by looking back at HCEI. And you're going to see 2 different approaches. First, we're going to have a panel that looks at policy issues. And the idea here is that we're going to try to really define what HCEI was and what it wasn't. And as the years have passed, I think a lot of us have heard HCEI linked with all sorts of things. And this is an effort to really go back and say what's valid, what's real, what was HCEI really about. The second panel that we're going to present this morning on HCEI will talk about business opportunities. And we're going to be, well, we have some extraordinarily intelligent people on both those panels, so I should probably avoid trying to get into details on the HCEI discussions. I do just want to say again that here at the Maui Energy Conference, we really do feel a debt of gratitude to the folks that developed HCEI. You know, again, this was something that gave us confidence that if people flew all the way to Maui, that there really was something going on in the islands to talk about. As we started looking at the program for this year, we kept asking ourselves, what's the logical next step for Hawaii after 10 years of HCEI? Where do we go from here? Over the last 12 months, the energy scene in Hawaii has shown us some of the answers. From the dispute over the Huhonua biomass plant on the Big Island, to the Sierra Club complaint filed on Maui about the use of coal by HC&S, to the efforts by the mayors of all the counties to try to move towards essentially a transportation RPS, and even the ongoing discussion of when or whether waste-to-energy plants and projects, really present a net environmental benefit. All of these topics have kind of come together and show that there is a weakness, something missing from HCEI. And what you find is that the concept of clean energy that was really the foundation of HCEI, it is inherently broad and flexible, but it really doesn't go directly to climate impacts. When you think clean and dirty, it just doesn't really match some of the current issues that we're working on. Some fossil fuels are cleaner than other fossil fuels, and natural gas, it will continue to take market share from coal regardless of how we regulate carbon. Trying to address climate change from a perspective of clean and dirty is just fundamentally unsatisfying. Our theme this year uses the term decarbonization. And as one of the speakers mentioned earlier, it's not necessarily a word that just rolls off your tongue. And it's worth taking a minute or two to explain what we were thinking on the program committee and what we mean with this term. The first thing we should say is that in our business, there's a tendency sometimes to think that we're really increasing or decreasing the amount of carbon with our actions. And adding control equipment or making a fuel switch, people often perceive that as decreasing or increasing emissions of carbon. The scientific reality here is that we are neither creating nor destroying carbon. Over millions of years, the Earth has developed a carbon cycle. You probably remember this from high school too. The oxygen that we breathe in reacts with the carbon in our bodies, and we exhale CO2. Plants respirate too, but for them, of course, they're breathing in CO2 and extracting the carbon and exhaling the O2. When we talk about decarbonization, we're talking about efforts to reduce the amount of carbon. We're not saying zero carbon. We're not kidding ourselves that we are getting rid of carbon. What we're talking about is reducing the amount of carbon that really ends up in the atmosphere. One final point on definitions here. The people on our program committee are very aware that certain compounds, particularly methane, appear on a ton-for-ton basis to be more of a concern in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is that over the next 2 days, there will be times that we're using this word carbon, but it's really just a shorthand reference for a number of compounds that are associated with climate impacts. For the next minute or two, I want to talk about the two most common approaches to regulating carbon in North America: cap and trade policies and carbon taxes. The current business opportunities are really in these areas. So cap and trade is an idea that really came out of air pollution control, and it's been relatively successful in that area. The cap is the maximum amount of the pollutant that can be emitted by all of the covered sources in a geographic area. Usually the idea is that the cap is decreasing over time. So logically, the effect of a shrinking cap should be to put upward pressure on the price. And price goes to the other part of cap and trade, which is, of course, trade. So what's being traded? Usually what's being traded are per ton allowances to emit the pollutant that we're regulating. And they get reported as a market price. So once you know the market price, you should, as a business owner, you should be able to look at your internal costs of projects. And you can find a business case to reduce your own emissions where, because of the setup of your operations, it's a lower cost opportunity for you. So the real goal of cap and trade was always to get people to use private investment dollars to affect their own emissions, and that would generate excess or surplus emissions that could then be traded. There's a California cap and trade program that sells greenhouse gas allowances, and I honestly didn't know this piece until recently. They do this jointly with two of the Canadian provinces. So Ontario and Quebec, they jointly auction greenhouse gas allowances with California. And we'll talk in more detail in a number of panels about what seems to make sense as a way to regulate carbon, but I just wanted you to be aware that the trends in the market today really are flat pricing for carbon. In California, they started this program in 2012, and the price per ton on carbon at that time was around $20. Since then, it's dropped to approximately $15 a ton, and it's basically stayed at that level. And there's a similar thing that we see in Europe, where the EU program has had a price essentially stuck at 10 euros per ton of carbon for a number of years. I guess when we talk about business opportunities, so far, carbon cap and trade systems, these allowances really have not been an investable asset. The pricing, the value has not increased over time. Again, in our panels, we'll talk about why that is. There are a number of factors, but it certainly has to give you pause if you think we've got a good business model today when prices for these allowances aren't increasing. Another point to note here is that in those allowances in the California scheme, they sell both emissions for the current year and they sell future allowances, in this case, 2021 allowances during the last auction. What's, again, really surprising if you think we have a system that works for regulating carbon is that the prices for the future years are equal or lower than the current year. So again, market participants are looking at this and they're saying, we don't believe that the price is going to be increasing. The main alternative to cap and trade that's been proposed until now is carbon taxation. And they're proponents of carbon taxes. They'll usually talk about a revenue neutral scheme. So the idea is that certain parts of the economy will have a carbon tax added to them and that can be reallocated to people presumably conducting more desirable activities. And some folks have looked at the Alaska scheme for fossil fuel, which provides for a permanent dividend fund, and have said, we could have the same idea for carbon. You could basically add a tax on one side and then give it back to folks as a dividend. So taxing or dividend, maybe that's just a matter of semantics, but we'll have those discussions in detail and we can talk about that. Up until probably a month ago, that was the end of my speech. And those were the two things to really talk about. But there's one other thing that's happened recently that really does deserve some discussion. And you may remember that our federal government shut down basically for one day, a month ago. And when that happened, they did come up with a budget agreement. In this budget agreement, they significantly expanded an income tax credit for carbon treatment and sequestration. The program is called 45Q, and if you haven't heard of it before, I don't blame you. Up until now, this was really a program designed for people in the oil production business. The original program was basically if you would inject carbon dioxide as a way to frack out more oil, you'd get the credit. But in this latest budget process, it has changed significantly. And there's a couple points that you really ought to know. Number one, this credit dollar-wise is pretty significant. I mentioned that the price on the emission side had been around $20 a ton. The credit is $35 a ton. And more importantly, there is no cap on the number of dollars that can be, used for this credit. And it also lasts for 12 years. So again, up until a month ago, we were probably talking just cap or trade, carbon tax. But the notion of actually removing carbon from the atmosphere may get new life with this legislation. And, we mentioned the brewing tour. That was frankly part of the discussion. He has a carbon dioxide capture system that takes carbon dioxide off of these big vats making beer and reuses them. So people like that made decisions partly for economics, partly for sustainability, they may see a significant benefit out of this.